Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Dialogue. I'm very happy to see all of you here today as we take a moment as a community to reflect upon Dr. King's life and its meaning to all of us. We gather virtually as we have become accustomed to do over the course of the past 10 months, but I am grateful that we are able to make this connection despite the physical distance that separates us. I'd like to thank the MLK Day of Dialogue Planning Committee for the work in putting together today's program. In particular, Chris Kennerly, Director, and Timothy Bussey, Associate Director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Ted Mason, Professor of English and Associate Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Howard Greer, Director of Campus Events. An awful lot happened in the year 2020, much of it connected or intertwined. This includes the pandemic, examples of systemic racial injustice, and political turmoil. But I find the terms that have been used often in the past few months, terms like history making and unprecedented, to be overused. While the events of the year 2020 were significant and had a major impact on our lives, there's something empty about labeling these as history making or unprecedented. It reduces history to some sort of measuring stick, unmoored from its original context and somehow separate from the lives we live now. An alternate view of history was presented by James Baldwin, who wrote, quote, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do." History, as Baldwin framed, is part of us, playing an active role in shaping our current circumstances. The events of January 6th vividly illustrate this. The storming of the US Capitol by armed, angry, and overwhelmingly white insurrectionists was not merely the product of any one government or administration, but rather as a part of a historical continuum of the use of violence to disrupt elections and disenfranchise voters of color, an example in a long line of examples taking up arms in defiance of a perceived loss of political privilege and cultural power. As we grapple with the events of our time, and as we aim to find a way forward towards change, our MLK Day of Dialogue is more important this year than ever. And so I'm delighted that we have with us this year as our keynote speaker, Dr. Eddie Glaub Jr., James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. Professor Glaub's doctorate, also from Princeton, was in religious studies, and he is the author of several books on religion, philosophy, and race. Professor Glaud is also an active public intellectual, writing for the New York Times and serving as a columnist for Time magazine. He's also a regular commentator on the MSNBC network, appearing frequently on shows such as Morning Joe and Meet the Press. His most recent book, which is also the subject and the framework for his presentation today, is Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own, was released in 2020 and addresses the many ways that Baldwin's writing forces us to confront America's history, its sins and shortcomings in order to understand the nation fully. After Professor Glaub speaks, there will be a question and answer session moderated by Nicole Therese Dutton, editor of the Kenyon Review. That will be followed by breakout sessions led by members of the faculty. A session on activism at the national level, facilitated by Professors Austin Johnson, Reggie Sanders, and Janae Schoenfeld, and a session on activism at the campus local level, facilitated by Professors David Maldonado Rivera, Kim Marie Murphy, and Kiana Parks. It is my pleasure to turn the screen over to Professor Eddie Glaub Jr. Welcome to Kenyon.
Professor Decatur, thank you so much for that gracious introduction. President Decatur, thank you so much for that gracious introduction. I'm so delighted to be here at Kenyon. We gather against the backdrop of a nation in crisis. I want to thank the planning committee for all the work that you've done to make today possible. Thank you, Howard Greer, for doing all of the stuff you're doing in the background to make sure that we can exist in this virtual world in a seemingly seamless way. My time is short, so I want to jump straight into this, if that's okay. Hopefully we can have something to talk about. Maybe I can prick your conscience for a while, or for a bit. Look, I've already said that we're gathered against the backdrop of a nation in crisis. In some ways, what we saw in Georgia with the election of John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock Not so much the election of politicians, politicians inevitably disappoint, but the kind of organizing that we saw that made their election possible, the demographic shifts that are making themselves known in the state of Georgia, and how everyday ordinary people have taken back in some ways their state, was in some ways an indication of the birth of a new America, or the beginnings of the birth of a new America. And you juxtapose that with what we saw on January 6th at the Capitol, are those who, in some ways, the last gasp of the conservative reaction to the period of the mid 20th century, of the 1960s. We see people cleaving to a world that is in fact dying, a world that Dr. King sacrificed his life in some ways to destroy. So I want to talk about Dr. King and Baldwin today against that backdrop. I'm going to try to leave the politics behind just for a little bit, although I won't. But I want to jump into something more specific here. So let me begin by way of two epigraphs. One from James Baldwin's No Name in the Street, and the other from Ralph Waldo Emerson's, one of my favorite essays, Circles. Quote, "It is terrible to watch people cling to their captivity and insist on their own destruction. I think Black people have always felt this about America and Americans, and have always seen spinning above the thoughtless head the shape of the wrath to come." Emerson, "Our culture is the predominance of an idea, which draws after it this train of cities and institutions. Let us rise into a new idea, and they will disappear." On March 16th, 1968, James Baldwin hesitated, caught a bit off guard by an unexpected request to introduce Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He walked to the podium at a fundraiser at the Anaheim Disneyland Hotel. Marlon Brando had organized the event for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Poor People's Campaign. Dr. King wanted to make the case for massive direct action in Washington, D.C. on behalf of America's poor, but found that many who once supported his desegregation efforts in the South were less than enthusiastic about his agenda around jobs. Desegregating lunch counters didn't cost much. Ending poverty would cost the nation billions of dollars, and sentimentality alone could not pay that bill. And despite all of the doubt and some of the criticism, King nevertheless persisted, and he needed the support. So this event was put on. Now, Jimmy approached the podium and announced in a somewhat halting manner his surprise at being asked to introduce Dr. King, and then launched into an abbreviated account of how they had arrived at this moment in 1968, just a month before King's assassination. Baldwin did not say much, if anything, about Dr. King, only that, quote unquote, Martin had spent most of his time in the early years of the movement, quote, in and out of jail, trying to redeem what we claim we live by, end quote. Instead, Jimmy told a brief story about the promise of those early days and the country's ongoing refusal to change. His was an effort, in some ways, to jog the memory and, by extension, the moral conscience of the audience. Quote, "What Rosa Parks was saying in 1956 in Montgomery, and what the Negroes were saying in their march for 381 days, Baldwin intoned, the country did not want to hear or did not hear," end quote. He invoked the quick passage of time between the beginning of the movement, the volatility of 1968, and the ugliness and sorrow that happened in between. Quote, "As time rolled on and kids, including people like Stokely Carmichael, were being beaten with chains, going to jail, marching up and down dusty highways, trying to change the conscience of this nation, still nobody heard and nobody cared," end quote. In some ways, Baldwin's introduction of King was all about America's betrayal, what I write about in Begin Again, about the wall of white supremacy that clearly stood in the way of fundamental transformation in the country, and about the extraordinary urgency they all faced at what was fast becoming the crossroads. Now, King did not acknowledge Baldwin in his speech. He simply offered generic thanks to all of those who spoke before him. The substance of his remarks, yet the substance of King's remarks that night echoed Baldwin's account of the country's betrayal. King didn't mince words. America was a decidedly racist country, he said. The problem can only be solved when there's a kind of coalition of conscience, he said. Quote, I'm not sure if we have that many consciences left. Too many have gone to sleep. But there are some left, and we got to be that creative minority ready to do battle for the sacred issues of life, ready to do battle for the principles of justice, goodwill, and brotherhood, he said. But like Baldwin, Dr. King struggled with the reality of white America's commitment to the belief that white people mattered more than others. Throughout this speech, he argued for the merits of the Poor People's Campaign. He talked about the dire poverty in the country. Quote, I've seen the rats and the roach, I've seen the roaches. He spoke about the immorality of the Vietnam War. In the end, he understood the nature of the challenge to his faith in the country's commitment to freedom. Quote, I must honestly confess that I go through moments of disappointment when I have to recognize that there aren't enough white persons in our country who are willing to cherish democratic principles over privilege. Wow. But I'm grateful to God that some are left, he said, end quote. Once lauded as one of the most respected men in the world, Dr. King now found himself in 1968 persona non grata as the nation turned its back on his moral vision. His position on the Vietnam War led some to call him a traitor. The New York Review of Books declared that he has, quote, been outstripped by the times, and one young Black woman even went so far as to call him a quote unquote sellout. And as Dr. King brought his speech to a close that night, he tried to reach for the promise of America. Quote, I believe we're going to get there because however much he strays away from it, the goal of America is freedom, end quote. But his somber tone and the sadness in his eyes betrayed those hopeful words. Now, this is not the Dr. King we typically celebrate on this holiday. National anniversaries of death can be a tricky lot to be used by whomever lay claim to the muted body buried in the ground that cannot speak back. Time can make matters worse. The farther we get away from the actual life lived, the more enchanted we are by the fables and myths that secure our illusions and deepen our fantasies. I think about my own uncle. When my uncle, who was my godfather, shot himself in the heart the day after we buried my grandfather, I couldn't understand the nature of his grief or his selfishness. His death just simply marked another casualty in the tragic history of my family. But with time, the immediacy of shock and loss gave way to the recollection of his infectious smile with that one gold tooth and his love of reggae music. Even the bullet to his heart became a romantic gesture, a final response to the father who failed to love him and the wife who left him the day before my grandfather died. But lost in that story, lost in the story of it all, was too much drink and the abuse of those who moved about in his most intimate spaces. My uncle's suicide became an example in the story of my own wounded attachments. And we often do this in our individual lives. We weave similar tales as well in our national stories. Our dead, enshrined in fable and myth, become who we want them to be. You know, Dr. King has been dead nearly 60 years now. And over this half century and a decade or so, his bones have been picked clean. Conservatives invoke his name in defense of their vision of a colorblind society that justifies the status quo. Liberals use him to authenticate their own milquetoast politics as they simply tinker around the edges and leave everything in place. And some Black politicians yoke his legacy to their own selfish ambitions. Dr. King becomes a justification for their own desires to walk the corridors of power. In some ways, King's life has been reduced to a 4-word sentence, I have a dream, and his politics to a basic affirmation of American ideals. He is the lead character in a story the nation tells itself about the movement, which begins with the landmark Supreme Court decision of 1954, the heroic refusal of Rosa Parks, the challenge of student sit-ins, and culminates with the 1963 March on Washington or the 1965 Selma March. It is a neat story with Southern villains and heightened drama and tragic deaths and heroic triumph. No mention, however, of Dr. King's depression. The story doesn't reckon with what he said to his friend, Reverend D.E. King, one night, quote, "I found out that all that I've been doing in trying to correct this system in America has been in vain. The whole thing will have to be done away with," King said. Instead, ours is a story that secures the inherent goodness of this country and enlists Dr. King's life in fortifying that illusion so that we can pat ourselves on the back and say a job well done. But a genuine reckoning with the man murdered on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel reveals a different story. In 1967 at Stanford University, a year before the fundraiser in Anaheim, Dr. King offered his assessment of the movement and the challenges ahead. Quote, "We must see that the struggles of today are difficult because we are struggling now for genuine equality. Negroes generally live in worse slums today than 20 or 25 years ago. In the North, schools are more segregated today than they were in 1954. The unemployment rate among whites at one time was about the same as the unemployment rate among Negroes. But today, the unemployment rate among Negroes is twice that of whites. And the average income of the Negro today is 50% less than whites. As we look at the problems," King said, "we see them growing and developing every day." It's almost as if he was talking about our own time. And here we are grappling with the devastation of COVID-19 in our own time, which has revealed the deep fissures in our society, how the inequality that characterizes our way of life has fueled the virus and has left close to 400,000 dead and so many lives devastated. We're so intent on celebrating Dr. King's life, of lifting up the dream, even when we mention the I've been to the mountaintop speech. We act like Christians during the holy season. We want to run past Saturday to get to and bask in the light of Resurrection Sunday. I'm more interested in Saturday Christians, But there's this sense in which we want to run to. Dr. King said, "I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land," but we lose sight of those words. We got some difficult days ahead. The preface to it all. The immediacy of the grief and shock of Dr. King's murder in 1968 and the over 100 uprisings in cities across the country in response to his death has given way to a myth about him and the extraordinary movement out of which he comes. And that myth sometimes protects the country from the damning reality that I've just described, or the damning reality you and I live. The damning reality we witnessed on January 6th. It provides cover for the unseemly truth that racism continues to organize this society. Any honest reckoning with death requires a more mature confrontation with the life in the grave. Only disaster awaits those who cleave to fable and myth. An honest reckoning with Dr. King's death affords us, amid the catastrophic consequences of Trumpism, amid the catastrophic consequences of those who cling to a dying world, another opportunity to confront the great scandal at the heart of American democracy. King insisted that, quote, "What it is necessary to see is that there has never been a single solid, determined commitment on the part of the vast majority of white Americans on the whole question of civil rights and on the whole question of racial equality," end quote. And we must ask ourselves why. We must ask ourselves why. Now, by 1968, James Baldwin had noticed something different in Dr. King. He seemed, quote, 5 years wearier and 5 years sadder, end quote. The demands of his leadership in the face of renewed white resistance, the shifts in the political climate around Vietnam, the riots in the city streets, and the militancy of Black power, along with his rejection of nonviolence and of King himself, took a toll on his spirit. Gwendolyn Green, who helped arrange his appearance in Los Angeles that evening, said she saw a visible change in Dr. King, right? Quote, he was dark, gaunt, and tired. He felt that his time was up, end quote. All of the people around King, staff and family, knew something was terribly wrong. And his speech that night reflected the turmoil, the depression, and disillusionment of his last days. Baldwin and King had been together just a few weeks earlier at a Carnegie Hall event in New York City, celebrating the 100th birthday of W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American intellectual and co-founder of the NAACP. Du Bois, after 7 decades of fighting for racial justice in the United States, had given up on America and died in exile in Accra, Ghana, on the eve of the March on Washington in 1963. Well, on this evening, February 23rd, 1968, an extraordinary gathering of scholars, entertainers, and activists celebrated his life. Baldwin read from a piece that he had written entitled Black Power. King disagreed with the rhetoric of Black Power and the symbolism of that moment. He offered the example that Dr. King did of Du Bois as a counter to Black Power. Quote, he exemplified Black Power in achievement, and he organized Black Power in action. It was no abstract slogan to him, end quote. But even then, King's remarks were shadowed by despair, quote. Negroes have heavy tasks today, King said. We were partially liberated and then re-enslaved, he said. We have to fight again on old battlefields, end quote. Before he was killed at the Lorraine Motel on April 4th, 1968, Baldwin and Dr. King would be together one last time for a fundraiser in New York City. Baldwin didn't have a dark suit for the occasion, so he ran out to purchase one and had it fitted. 2 weeks later, as Baldwin famously recalled in No Name in the Street, I wore this same suit, quote, to Martin's funeral, end quote. Baldwin had returned to California. He was sitting by the swimming pool with Billy D. Williams at his rented house in Palm Springs when the phone rang. Jimmy picked it up. Jimmy, Martin's just been shot. He's not dead yet, but it's a head wound, end quote. Baldwin dropped the phone and wept. There's an intimate grief here that cannot be glossed over with some abstract idea of the loss of a leader. In a way, Baldwin and King, no matter their temperamental distance, moved together as they struggled to make real the promise of American democracy. King was the preacher, Baldwin the poet, and of course the two are interchangeable. Billy D. Williams said that Martin's death was with Jimmy for a long time. I doubt if he ever got over it. Much of his hope died with King, he said. Something in Jimmy, much more than his voice, broke on April 4th, 1968. And Baldwin was not naive about the human capacity for evil, especially among white folk. He knew immediately what it meant to be vulnerable to the whims of others who held a certain kind of power over you. Quote, if you're a Negro, you're in the center of that peculiar affliction, he said, because anybody can touch you when the sun goes down. You know, you're the target of everybody's fantasies, end quote. Baldwin didn't need King's murder to learn that lesson. It was the fact that they killed someone who espoused love, who was an apostle of nonviolence. And King's death revealed the depths of their debasement. Baldwin wrote of King's murder and funeral, quote, since Martin's death in Memphis and that tremendous day in Atlanta, something has altered in me, something has gone away. Perhaps even more than the death itself, the manner of his death has forced me into a judgment concerning human life and human beings, which I've always been reluctant to make. Incontestably, alas, most people are not in action worth very much. And yet every human being is an unprecedented miracle. One tries to treat them as the miracles they are, while trying to protect oneself against the disasters they've become, end quote. Baldwin struggled to come to terms with the meaning of King's death. What his murder said about the country, about white people, about human beings in general, but perhaps more importantly, he struggled to come to terms with the meaning of King's living witness. Quote, my own mind after I left Atlanta began to move backward in time to places, people, events I thought I had forgotten. Sorrow drove it there, he says. Sorrow and a certain kind of bewilderment, end quote. Baldwin sought to tell the story of the confusion and the mourning of loss. The past and fragmented memories became not so much a place of refuge, but ruin and rubble filled with bodies and broken promises ready to excavate. After King's murder, he had to gather up the pieces, not only of himself, but of Black folk buried beneath the ongoing disaster that was the country. And the disasters never stopped. King's death, just like Medgar Evers and Malcolm X's, and all the others did not stop. The bodies lining the Mississippi River, all the bodies left in the wake of America's refusal and the ongoing grief of Black families who had to bury their dead. Time kept moving. And white people didn't stop being white people. Baldwin and Black America had to mourn and make sense of unimaginable loss with little time to do so because the nastiness of the world kept coming at them. What would it mean to recall King's life then in the context of the unimaginable act of his murder? Time always haunts the story and distorts the memory. In No Name in the Street, Baldwin wrote of the encounter with Dr. King at the Brando fundraiser. Quote, we sat down in a relatively secluded corner and tried to bring each other up to date. Alas, it would never be possible. We had first met during the last days of the Montgomery bus boycott, and how long ago was that? It was senseless to say 8 years, 10 years ago. It was longer ago than time can reckon, Baldwin says. And here, I think he's engaged with Marcel Proust here, but that's a different story we could talk about later. Some 7 years earlier than this moment in March of '68, in an article for Harper's Magazine entitled The Dangerous Road Before Martin Luther King, Baldwin noted the difference in King's voice from the heady days of the bus boycott in '55. Quote, by the time we met again, he was more beleaguered than he had ever been before. And not only by his enemies in the white South, he did not look any older, and yet there was a new note of anguish in his voice, end quote. King's life telescoped the manic pace of the Black freedom movement and foreshadowed the betrayal of the country. It's ironic then that we celebrate him in the way that we do. Baldwin wrote quote, well, I don't know what, well, let me say it differently. Now, King's life telescoped the manic pace of the Black freedom movement and foreshadowed the betrayal of the country. You remember King's words, well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, right? We've got some difficult days ahead. We're living in those difficult days now. It seems that our country stands on a knife's edge. Democratic norms have been cast aside. Our institutions seem fundamentally broken. Hyperpartisanship, which tracks so closely with racial animus, defines our public deliberations. Selfishness and greed overwhelm any robust idea of the public good. People are claiming liberty as a value, when in fact liberty has become a synonym for selfishness. They're too damn selfish to put on a mask. As 400,000, close to 400,000 of our fellows are dead. And then they have the nerve to sack the Capitol. In the name of what? The idea that only white voters matter. Because if we are to believe them, they are the only ones who can be true patriots. They are the only ones who have the right to dissent. They are the only ones who really carry the burdens of citizenship. All the rest of us should be grateful and shut the hell up. And if we are sensible and true to what they say, if we understand what they say, then Donald Trump is actually right that he won by a landslide. If white voters are the only voters that matter. When Baldwin wrote the piece for Harper's on Dr. King in 1961, He had already spied the significant challenges on the horizon. He knew that fundamental change in this country required of us a new creation. But the battle to achieve this had not ended. It had scarcely begun, Baldwin wrote in 1961. King is entirely right when he says, Baldwin wrote, that segregation is dead. Baldwin then says, the real question which faces the Republic is just how long, how violent, and how expensive the funeral is going to be. And this question is up to the Republic to resolve. It is not in King's hands, end quote. Well, the Republic answered with a rifle shot to King's head. And as of late, with the supporters of Donald Trump sacking the people's house. What Baldwin referred to as the dangerous road before Dr. King was whether or not the country could muster the courage to confront its demons and transform itself into a genuine democracy as King demanded. Could America tell itself the truth about how we all have arrived at this moment about its past? And if we failed, what would be its cost? And here we are, I'm coming to a close. That's a preacherly tactic, don't believe me. Right. Here we are, so many decades later, a nation in crisis. We still haven't become the kinds of people democracies require because we're so committed to this idea that white people ought to be valued more than others. We hear people trying to, in some ways, compromise and make peace with the ugliness at the heart of this fragile experiment in democracy, the ugliness that threatens to consume it all. You know, at the time of his death, Dr. King understood that if we are going to achieve our country, we will have to shatter the fables and myths that protect our national innocence. We will have to look in the mirror and finally see what or who or what is looking back at us. That can't happen still. The last 4 years, hell, the last few days have ripped off the scab of this nation's racial politics. All of the racial dog whistles and coded speech that have been a part of America's politics have been tossed away for an explicit appeal to white America, an explicit appeal to white grievance, white resentment, and white hatreds. The genie is finally out of the bottle. Our task is not to push it back in, but to imagine the country otherwise. Are we willing to imagine America as a truly multiracial democracy? Or are we willing to toss this fragile experiment of democracy into the trash bin because we refuse to give up the idea that white people are valued more than others? Herman Melville comes to mind. Quote, but not yet have we solved the incantation of this whiteness and learned why it appeals with such power to the soul, end quote. The celebration of Dr. King in this moment of storm and stress occasions an opportunity for us to be otherwise. We can confront the life in the grave, not for who we want Dr. King to be, but for who he actually was, faults and all. And with him, imagine a new life for the nation. Here, the beloved community can take shape. In our intimate relationships with each other, we can break down the barriers that blind us to the humanity of those with whom we live. We can cast away the false idols of racism and treasure the beauty of human beings and all of their difference. We can imagine a new social and moral contract, a new covenant, where we guarantee our fellows healthcare as a right. We guarantee everyone a basic quality of life with a roof over their head and a living wage. Guarantee every human being in the United States a life where they can live safely and securely. How Dr. King imagined civic life, how he imagined leadership, how he insisted on the value of the beloved community shorn of sentimentality and rooted in a just order, his unshakable willingness to speak truth to power no matter the consequence. These values ought to shape our embrace of him, not the image of the happy nonviolent saint who sanctifies our national innocence. Stop pimping Dr. King to protect yourself from looking the ugliness of who we are squarely in the face. I think this is what makes this particular celebration of his life this year so special. You can't do it because the ugliness is in plain sight. If we are to genuinely celebrate the life and sacrifice of Dr. King, let's leave the lies about him behind. Let's confront his deep depression in the last days of his life. Let us challenge ourselves to imagine a new America, because our ongoing betrayal is what sent him spiraling. Let's imagine a country where justice truly matters. But let us ask ourselves as individuals, as the late novelist Toni Morrison asked herself, would Dr. King be disappointed in me, she asked. Dr. King gave his life so that we might be better. As Morrison put it, quote, his confidence that we were finer than we thought, that there were moral grounds we would not abandon, lines of civil behavior we simply would not cross, that there were things we would gladly give up for the public good, that a comfortable life resting on the shoulders of other people's misery was an abomination, end quote. Have we assumed the personal responsibility for alleviating social harm, ordinary, habitual, and irresistible, Morrison asked? Or are we content to leave him and his call upon us in the grave? This celebration offers us a chance to be otherwise, offers us a chance for an honest assessment of where we are and an opportunity to rededicate ourselves to fight for the beloved community. And the question that you have to ask yourself, and it's a question I ask myself daily, would he be disappointed in me? Thank you so much. Looking forward to the question.
Hi, Dr. Glaude. I'm Nicole Perez-Dutton. I'm the editor of the Kenyon Review. I want to thank you for being with us this afternoon and for sharing your thoughts. And I have to say, I feel both a little shattered and lifted by what you shared with us today. We are going to have a Q&A session right now, about 15 minutes long, and then following that, there will be an opportunity to continue the conversation in 2 different breakout rooms. But I wanted to say, or I wanted to start with a question, if I may. I was really interested in and I appreciate the work of recovery that happens in like complicating this notion of King by giving us, a sense of him as a whole person. I appreciate that. And I appreciate also just kind of understanding the personal physical stakes that he was working with in his work. And I wonder what we learn from that, like as we understand his complexity, what we can learn and carry from that understanding that may help us navigate the current moment. You ended with a whole series of calls, but what it seems to me that what the suggestion here is that we need to embody this notion of the ongoing truth and reconciliation project that our nation seems to require. And my question for you is how do we do that, and what do we learn from King's legacy and his life that's going to help equip us to move forward in that goal toward freedom?
I mean, it's such a great question. It's a hard question, actually. I wrote Begin Again to try to answer it, because Baldwin collapses after King's assassinated in 68. In 69, he attempts suicide because of a failed relationship, as well as his sorrow, because of his sorrow and despairing. He was despairing. And what I found in grappling with Baldwin's own sense of his despair was that, he decides to bear witness to the suffering, right? He has to, the way in which he picks up the pieces is by insisting on telling the story of what he sees and what he lives. And this is what's so important about that moment in Anaheim, because King, it's a month before King is assassinated. But both Baldwin and King are recognizing that the country is trying to conscript the civil rights into its own narrative of exceptionalism. And they're trying to resist it in real time by narrating the movement, right? They're trying to tell the story of what happened. And when you read No Name in the Street, Baldwin is trying to do that as well. And at the level of structure and form, it's fragmented because he's trying to remember it. And that memory has been fragmented by trauma, obviously. So part of what we have to do in the face of the country's ongoing betrayal is to bear witness no matter what, is to continue to give voice to the suffering, right? To become the kinds of poets that Baldwin and Emerson called us to be. Now, I don't want to aestheticize the point that I'm making, right? Because this is the kind of politics. This is what Brian Stevenson is doing. This is what Alicia Garza is doing in her own way. This is what activists on the ground are doing as they challenge America's self-conception by exposing not only the hypocrisy of its narrative, but by exposing the devastation of that hypocrisy in real lived terms, right? So how do we do it? Well, first we have to confront honestly our own despair, to try to give voice to the trauma that has taken root in our souls, in our spirits, and to do so on behalf or in behalf of a more just, or what Baldwin might describe as the New Jerusalem. You never give up on it. It's almost Sisyphean though. I don't want to make him too Camus-like, but it becomes this, it ain't about the end. It's about what Talib Kweli calls the beautiful struggle itself. You know?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for
Sure.
that. There was a lot of questions for you, so I'm gonna.
Okay, so I'll be short. I'll be short, I promise.
Presenting them for you. And this is a question coming from Uton Getzler. He says, I heard in your phrasing that liberals tinker around the edges but leave things in place. An echo of Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, where he states that he had, quote, almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the great stumbling block is the white moderate. Do you think that the value public rhetoric places on bipartisanship or nonpartisanship is a kind of moderation that preserves the status quo and acts as just that stumbling block?
Absolutely. You know, that bipartisanship or compromise or appeals to unity in the aftermath of the expression of such ugliness, right? Someone has to bear the brunt of it all. You know, you think about C. Van Woodward's The Strange Career of Jim Crow, this white Southern historian at Yale writing about, you know, the emergence of Jim Crow in the South. And he said that, you know, the black slave or black people in the United States gained their rights through a falling out between white people. Now they stood to lose it through a reconciliation between white people. So as the compromise happens, who has to bear the brunt? What does it mean to compromise with those who believe that only white voters should matter? What does that compromise look like? What does it mean to tinker around the edges when it comes to an education system that refuses to educate all of its children? Who has to bear the brunt of tinkering around the edges? What does it mean to compromise around a healthcare system that leaves so many Americans vulnerable, right, to disease, to lose everything? And the pandemic exposes it for what it is. And our choice is to tinker around the edges, right? And so Baldwin, King is skeptical, rightly, in the letter from Birmingham jail. There's a moment, and I'll say this now, shut up, I said I was gonna be shorter. Baldwin says, I'm always skeptical of somebody who wants to do something for me as opposed to with me, right? So if we think of, this is another feature of the claim that I didn't talk about. If we think of racial justice or racial equality as a philanthropic enterprise, as a charitable gesture, as something that you can give to me, then we're both trapped. Because equality is not yours to give to anybody, right? And sometimes that seems to be the orientation of some of them. You know, we're either Willie Horton or Bigger Thomas, you know.
Absolutely. I appreciate too, there's something really generous in your response that you ask us more questions when in response to the question. I love that. I love that. This is a question from Taylor Womack. In your book, you seem to argue that periods of American history have been marked by movements for change being followed by movements to preserve the status quo. I believe this pattern communicates that the truth can be offensive. In your opinion, is disunity at the core of the fight for change, or is there a way we can be unified even in disagreement?
Yeah, I think so. I think we can. There's a consensus, and I'm not referring to kind of, this historiography, this consensus historiography of the 1950s that tries to mute all conflict, says there's some unified values. The consensus that has shaped American life is a consensus around whiteness. We can trace it in our immigration law. We understand that it's precisely this ideology of whiteness that led to the dismantling of radical Reconstruction, the triumph of the lost cause with the Compromise of 1877, and the emergence of a US nation state that became a model for Hitler's Germany, right? And so there are these moments where that consensus has reasserted itself, and it's not the possession of the South. Let's be very clear. As Malcolm says, as long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're in the South, right? And so this ideology of whiteness cuts across region, and it is asserted at the moment in which it seems that whiteness is under siege, that it's about to be decentered, right? So we're in this moment now where demographic shifts are such that folks are unsettled. They don't know what demographics aren't destiny, but they don't know what this country looks like, what it's going to look like with all of these racially ambiguous babies on commercials and TikTok interracial relationships and all of this stuff is happening. Folk are losing their mind, right? In interesting sorts of ways. And so part of what we're witnessing, I'm tinkering with an essay now, tentatively titled The Shattering of an American Consensus, where that notion of whiteness that has been behind the scenes, guiding and dictating decision-making, may finally be collapsing. Now, that doesn't guarantee that we're going to be anywhere else. It could lead to, another form of racial apartheid, where we're just going to stay in Indiana, or we're going to stay in our havens in Ohio, right? In certain towns in Ohio and the like, right? It could just lead to further segregation and fragmentation. But it's also, as the late Stuart Hall says, it's a conjunctural moment where there's crisis and possibility, right? Crisis and possibility. And the few of us who are committed to a genuinely multiracial democracy, if we act together, we can lay the foundations for a different kind of consensus, a different kind of American unity, if that makes sense.
Absolutely does. And thank you for ending that on a hopeful note. I appreciate that. I have one more question here.
Sure.
Let's see. And this is from Elena Spivak. In your book, you seem to argue, I'm sorry. I have the same question written twice. But can I go back before another question gets loaded for me here? Can I go back and just ask you also, it seems to me that this issue of race is not a new one, and also of the conflict, but also the fact of, where people are stationed kind of in the social landscape as regarded race. And so you just mentioned, the wildness that's happening right now in this kind of destabilized moment of not recognize what the population is going to look like, and that the look of the people being a real question. That feels to me a very old and familiar thing. And then I wondered if you could speak to that. And then also the notion of whiteness seems to me like that's the thing that's often in flux too. Right, the notion of white, like some people just got to be white, like not that long ago. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about that.
Right. So there is this, I don't want to suggest that whiteness is stable in any, it's fixed. It's constantly evolving and changing and shifting in light of the material conditions that on which we live, right? But part of what I'm saying is that the through line of American history is a kind of practice of valuation, that no matter how whiteness is defined or how it evolves, it's still a process or a procedure by which some bodies are valued more than others. And that valuation evidences itself in social, political, and economic arrangements, right? With a few folks who can move, right, as exceptions, But for the most part, the valuation evidences itself, right, in very clear ways in which disadvantage and advantages are distributed, right? Now, in this case, in terms of the second part, demographic shifts, you're right, there have always been these kind of challenges, right? And we can see that again by just charting immigration law. But for the first time, demographically, the country will be a minority majority nation within a few years. It's like right around the corner. And people see it already evidenced in our politics. That's why everybody lost it. A lot of folks lost their mind with 2008, with the election of Barack Obama. We saw the demographic shifts and its implication in Georgia. Remember, Georgia produced Newt Gingrich, Cobb County. Georgia also produced that horrific photo of Bill Clinton and Sam Nunn standing in front of Stone Mountain with all those Black prisoners behind them, suggesting or giving us a sense of a representation of the Democratic Party's strategy of triangulation as they embraced, the logic that would lead to an expansion of the carceral state. Now those demographic shifts have flipped Georgia, right? It's not blue, but it's purple. And we know it's it's happening in Texas. We know it's happening in North Carolina. We know it's happening in Mississippi, right? And so it's a difference because and let me say this too, it's happening at the very moment in which the empire seems to be collapsing, right? Where America's standing as a global power is being challenged, right? So this sense of identity that comes with a certain set of received understandings, a certain set of inheritances, right, seems to be fundamentally destable. So in that sense, as we try to understand the conjunctural moment, we see parallels, but there's something distinct about them, I think, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for that clarification.
Sure.
I've got two more questions for you.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. This is great.
Thank you. Thank you for being so patient with all of this. So let's see. This is a question from Kiana, and she has asked, how do we approach media-driven fake news, real-time myth-making, and compounding immediacy of this moment?
Well, if I had the answer to that, Professor Parks, I would, ooh, Lord. And I want to be very, very clear that I'm out here trying to figure this out like everybody else. I'm wading in the waters too. The collapse of the deliberative space, we used to call it the tabloization, how tabloids had overrun, right, American deliberative life. But what we know is that there's a kind of, what Timothy Snyder and others have called the big lie, and how this propaganda machine that has the attention of large numbers of Americans, how it has in some ways complicated how we engage in the exchange of reasons. That if you don't have, let me say it differently, if bad faith animates, right, how we engage with each other, which means that we don't trust each other's utterances, I don't know how democracy works. So I'm saying this to Kiana in a way that I'm struggling with how to fix that. I don't know. Because when the communicative dimension of democracies collapse, then what you're going to have are CEOs of Twitter making decisions. No matter how much we liked it, when they removed them from Twitter, it still was a CEO on a private platform that supposedly has this kind of public, deliberative dimension, making decisions. So I'm worried about the state of democracy in this area. So I have no answer yet. I'm still worried. See, right there, you're going to make me want to go get some Jameson.
We've got one last question, and this is from Naomi Enright. In your words, I hear a call to dismantle the ideology of whiteness and inherent racial difference, what Brian Stevenson calls, quote, the narrative of racial difference, end quote. How essential do you think a dismantling of this ethos and the language that supports it is to dismantling anti-Blackness and systemic inequity?
I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, look, I think I take my cue from Jimmy, there's a way in which Baldwin, even in, whether you're reading Fire Next Time or No Name in the Street, he understands the necessity of responding to racialized discourses with a racialized discourse, right? It's almost the fact of America's racial hierarchy necessitates me inhabiting a kind of Blackness that negates the negation, right? But then Baldwin says very clearly that he doesn't want us to become them, whomever, and them, of course, can be marked in a very specific way if we talk about it, or it could be just the generality in some ways. So he says, and it's one of these favorite lines that I say it, and it moves me emotionally every time I say it, no matter how many times I say it. Baldwin says he wants us to do something unprecedented, and that is to create a self without the need for enemies. What would that look like? What would that involve? What sort of country would this be without the undertow of these assumptions of valuation that have shaped so much of this place, right? So I think I think it's really important for us not to slip into a kind of easy sentimentality about us all being human beings. No, that's not what we're trying to reach for, right? But what does it mean to kind of to live in the complexity of the individuals and the peoples with whom we inhabit the world, right? And to revel in that without bringing a host of judgments about their relative value. I'm not really saying much, I guess, but the short answer to the question is, of course.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glaub, for being with us and for answering questions.
I wish we had more time.
I do. Well, I do too. I definitely do. But there are 2 breakout rooms which people can go to and talk more with you about these ideas. And again, just so generous and so rigorous. And I love the love in the talk. I love the love and begin again. Thank you so much. Let me just let people know there's the two breakout rooms are national activism and campus local activism. You should be able to get yourself over to those breakout sessions if you want to. If you have any problem doing that, then what you can do is call to the host or write to the host in the chat along the side of the screen here and let them know what room you would like to go to. And then you should be transported into that room pretty quickly, not maybe instantaneously, but pretty quickly. So thank you all for that. And thank you, Dr. Glaud, for being with us today. I don't think there's any other, I don't think there's any transition. I think we're going right to the breakout rooms.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes. Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.